He was offered a job to go and teach Chinese civilian pilots stand flies planes. It's a job.
Great group.
From Top Gun fighter pilot to solitary confinement in an Australian jail.
This is a country coming after my husband. One man against the US.
The military is privy to secrets and they cannot trade those secrets away.
America says Daniel Duggan gave military secrets to China.
So you would say these pilots are cashing in on their own country?
It's a betrayal.
And must be punished.
So not a single other pilot has been charged?
No.
Only Dan?
Only Dan.
Why?
That's the million-dollar question.
But his family say he's no traitor.
This is one big mistake.
He's a hero.
There's a hole in my heart. I don't have my dad anymore. He's gone.
That's next on 60 Minutes. Who is the real Daniel Edmund Duggan? It's a simple question, but the answer is highly contested and has enormous consequences. For his family and a large group of supporters, he's a hero. A former US Marine fighter pilot turned proud Australian citizen, a loving husband and a devoted dad. For others, though, namely the United States government, he's a traitor, accused of supplying China with top-secret military information. For the past 19 months, Duggan has been sitting in Australian prisons fighting attempts to send him back to the US. A decision about his extradition is expected within weeks. But if the Americans get a hold of him and can prove he sold them out, he'll face up to 65 more years locked up.
Hi, this is Dan Duggan. I'm a former U.S. Marine Harrier jump jet pilot and weapons and tactics instructor.
When it comes to combat, Daniel Duggan can battle with the best.
I trained fellow fighter pilots in air combat tactics and flew from aircraft carriers around the globe.
But the country this aviator once served is now fighting him.
One man against the US. It's disgraceful.
To his wife, Saffrine Duggan, and their 6 kids, Daniel is a hero.
I was blown away. He was my Top Gun.
But in the eyes of the US government, this Top Gun is a traitor. He's accused of doing what no US military personnel should ever do: give away secret intelligence to China.
The military is privy to secrets and they cannot trade those secrets away with foreign countries, with foreign competitors, with foreign adversaries.
Homeland Security expert Dr. Charles E. Dell says the allegations against Daniel Duggan couldn't be more serious. The charges are mired in legal jargon. But the US claims when the former Marine Major was employed at a flying school in South Africa in 2012, he taught Chinese military pilots secret combat techniques, including how to take off and land on aircraft carriers.
The United States and its allies have advantage because of their combat experience. You do not want your adversary to understand that. The last thing in the world that we want to do is make the Chinese military more capable, more adept at being able to fight.
Do you think the US is making an example out of your husband?
Yes. My husband is being used as a pawn in this geopolitical mess that's happening right now.
Saffrine Duggan says the allegations are ridiculous. She finds it impossible to understand why it's taken more than a decade to come about. And she's furious her husband has to be locked up in maximum security while he waits to find out if he'll be extradited to the United States. Another prospect she can't bear to contemplate.
He's put on a plane and taken to the US. He's taken away immediately. He's gone. It's a 65-year sentence. It's a death sentence for my husband, who is in his 50s. If you add that on, that's 120 years. We will never see him again. My kids will never grow up with a father.
Daniel Duggan always wanted to be a pilot. He joined the Marines in 1990 and flew Harrier jets. In 2002, his service ended and he moved to Australia. 10 years later, he became an Aussie. But curiously, instead of being a dual national, he gave up his American citizenship. It was while living in Tasmania he met and fell in love with Saffrine.
Dan had an adventure company, flying planes, and I was a photographer.
What you're about to do is probably one of the most unique corporate events that you could have possibly done anywhere in the world.
My heart skipped a beat and hasn't stopped skipping a beat ever since I met him. We had the 3 kids, Dan's 3 kids. It was a beautiful time.
Life was good, but while running his business in Tasmania, Duggan also took temporary contracts to train pilots at a flying school in South Africa. It's what happened there between 2009 and 2012 that the Americans are now questioning. Daniel says he only ever taught civilian pilots from China, but the US claims they were in fact Chinese military aviators. Dr. Edel says it's often difficult to separate the two.
The Chinese have introduced a concept that they call civil-military fusion and how they go about acquiring technology, but it basically lays out the case that there is no distinction between civilian and military application and use. There is no bright shining line between those who are trained in the civilian arena and those who have the ability to actualize things from a military perspective when you're dealing with the Chinese state.
So back in 2012, would there have been a big difference between a civilian pilot and a military pilot? Would that have been more clear-cut?
I think even in 2012, there were concerns about the Chinese military.
I served honorably and proudly for 12 years. There was not one time at any point where my oath to the Constitution was ever violated or in question ever.
You're listening to Daniel Duggan, speaking to a supporter from inside his prison cell, where he's now been in solitary confinement for 569 days. Duggan argues the work he was doing in South Africa was all above board, and he certainly wasn't training Chinese military pilots.
I was a part-time employee of one of the world's top test pilot schools in the world that was run by some of the most highly regarded aviation professionals in the world.
He was offered a job to go and teach civilian pilots, Chinese civilian pilots, and Dan flies planes. That's a job.
But America says, as a former Marine fighter pilot, Duggan needed government approval in the form of a state-approved licence to do that kind of work.
What was Dan's understanding about needing a licence to train pilots?
Dan's a smart, intelligent man. There was no permission needed because they're training civilian pilots.
So he was conscious of doing the right thing?
Absolutely. Yes, he knows the procedures.
I have never intentionally, willingly, and knowingly violated any law, any restriction from any country, anywhere in the world throughout my entire life.
There's no way that this could be one big mistake, that he should have got a licence, he should have got approval by the US.
This is one big mistake. He didn't need approval to teach pilots to train in South Africa on the job he was doing.
Let's put a name on it. It's a betrayal. Ultimately, it's to do with money. You're probably willing then to turn a blind eye. You're probably willing to put that sense of duty and patriotism into the corner, hoping that you might get away with it. Well, you won't.
Former UK Defence Minister Tobias Ellwood says his country has faced similar controversies, with a number of former RAF pilots earning big money to help the Chinese. As a consequence, he has little sympathy for Daniel Duggan.
We are entering a dangerous era now. Anybody serving in the British Armed Forces or the Australian or the American, you may leave the armed forces, but your loyalty to the nation must remain sacrosanct.
So when you look at the conspiracy charge against Daniel Duggan, just how serious is that allegation?
It is huge, and it's a testament as to what China will now do to try and better understand what our doctrines and protocols are about.
So you would say these pilots are cashing in on their own country?
I think it's done initially by naivety, but the way it works with when you get caught and ensnared into these systems is that you feel that you then can no longer say no because you've crossed perhaps a thin red line. But then you get immersed in providing more and more information, perhaps being lured in, and that takes you into a very, very dangerous place indeed.
The allegations against Duggan include that he laundered the money he was paid. But Saffrine says this accusation is laughable. Yes, she acknowledges Daniel was paid $180,000 in total, but says all of the money was legally declared in Australia.
So how do you pay tax on your own income and then it gets called money laundering? I mean, it's ridiculous. It's a tiny amount of money in the scheme of putting my husband through 18 months of solitary confinement.
Saffrine says her husband's treatment has been appalling and that he's been singled out unfairly. But it hasn't only been training Chinese pilots in South Africa that's drawn suspicion. In 2014, Duggan relocated his entire family from Australia to China. Again, though, Saffrine says there was nothing untoward about the move.
It was the place to be. There was lots of Australians going over there. Asia was a real hotspot.
And what was Dan doing there?
Dan was an aviation consultant. The aviation industry was starting to boom, and he worked with airports and safety management.
After 6 years, Saff and the kids returned home to Australia. But for Daniel, it wasn't that simple. It's not clear why, but the Chinese government confiscated his passport and didn't return it until September 2022. Duggan immediately flew home, not knowing bigger trouble was brewing.
This photo here, what does this photo mean to you now?
It means a lot. Dan actually took this photo as a selfie to text Mum and say, "It's okay, we've made it to school." He's got this.
It was only a month after coming home to Orange in regional New South Wales. A normal day. Daniel dropped his kids at school before heading to the local shops. But out of the blue, in the supermarket car park, he was surrounded by Australian Federal Police.
He was coming to bring a coffee to me at my work. And I waited and waited. Then I got a phone call from him saying, "I'm at the Orange police station. I've been arrested." And I'm like, "I don't understand." And then I go down to the police station.
And what are you told?
That your husband's been arrested by the US government. She looked at his file and said, "Oh, this looks bad." I said, "What do you mean this looks bad?"
Did you ever think at that point that it had anything to do with his military experience, him serving his country?
No. I didn't know what it was about. We didn't know for 2 months after. We didn't even know why he'd been arrested.
Were you worried that there was something about your husband you didn't know?
No.
But the United States government claims there is. Rightly or wrongly, they see him as a threat to their homeland security.
So not a single other pilot has been charged?
No.
Only Dan?
Only Dan.
Why?
Okay, bye boys, have a good day. Have a good day, sweetie. You too, first day back. You want to take this one or Hazel?
Saffrine Duggan never imagined she'd be forced to raise 6 children on her own.
Not enough in there.
Are we making this shorts?
But that's been the case for the last 19 months. While her husband, Daniel, has been locked up in Lithgow's maximum security prison, awaiting a decision about whether he'll be extradited to the United States.
He's living a nightmare. It's like living in your bathroom. 2 by 4 metre cell. This is an innocent man that has no Australian charges.
Saffrine's right. Her husband is not accused of any Australian crime, but the allegations he faces in the US are serious. The 55-year-old former Marine pilot is accused of trading top-secret military tactics with China when he taught at a flying school in South Africa more than a decade ago.
They call it exporting defence services, so training in techniques, tactics and procedures acquired from your time in the military to another military who are potentially an adversary.
Dr. Glenn Kolomitz spent 30 years in the Australian Army. Now an international lawyer and defence analyst, he's gone into battle for Duggan, who he says has become a political prisoner. Why is the US so out to get him?
We can link this almost to the day when China went from being the trading partner and this friend, broadly this friend, to being the adversary, almost to the day. And suddenly, bang, there's this indictment raised, there's allegations raised in the US against Dan, notwithstanding it was many, many years after the allegations allegedly took place. So it reeks of politics and it reeks of messaging to China.
This is the indictment against Duggan, prepared by the US government. It's 17 pages of damning claims.
Whether to indict somebody.
But Glenn Kolomitz is damning of it.
There is no truth to anything in that indictment.
Dan's dealings with China are all through this indictment.
That's part of the irrelevance, because the charges relate to his work in South Africa only. Any mention of China is totally irrelevant to the charges. It's inflammatory.
Dr. Kolomitz also argues there was nothing secret about any of the training Duggan did in South Africa, or who was being taught. He says what the civilian pilots were all learning could easily be sourced from textbooks or by searching the internet.
The training that Dan and this company were delivering is publicly available.
Is it not different, though, to have somebody actually sitting next to you going, you pull this lever, you do this?
Oh, absolutely. There's always a difference. There's a saying, you can't learn to fly a plane by reading a book. Nonetheless, the flying that Dan was providing is all out there on the internet.
Daniel Duggan denies doing anything wrong and that the school in South Africa was training civilian pilots, identifying a civilian pilot to a military pilot. Is that something that would be clear?
Well, I think this is how China goes about its business. It very much makes it a grey area. This is designed to lure people in, to think it's sort of quite innocent. But there's a step further than that when you start speaking about what you did when you wore the uniform. And that crosses a very, very clear line.
Before becoming an MP, Tobias Ellwood was a lieutenant colonel in the British Army. He says military personnel should know their ongoing obligations to their country.
When you sign up to the military, what oath or promise do you make about sharing your military skills?
Well, you make a promise to absolutely remain loyal to the realm.
But sadly, that's not always the case. At the time of Duggan's arrest in 2022, 30 RAF pilots were also being investigated over their dealings with China. Tobias Ellwood says they were warned to stop or face prosecution. Shortly after, tough new laws were introduced in the UK, banning former military personnel from sharing their knowledge with countries seen as high risk. Australia too has now adopted similar rules.
Why does China look to Western countries to train its military pilots?
Well, China is growing in its military competence, certainly in its power, but it's not actually engaged in warfare. That's when you're truly tested. China is trying to glean from the West, particularly Australia, America and Britain that lead on these fronts, as to how we do things.
In June last year, the US placed the South African flying school where Duggan had worked on a national security blacklist for providing training to Chinese military pilots using Western and NATO sources. But the company told us he only ever had a very short involvement with them, and most of the issues relating to Duggan had nothing to do with them. So any of the other training pilots over there, had there been any consequences for the other trainers?
No, none.
So not a single other pilot has been charged?
No,
Only Dan?
only Dan.
If Glenn Kolomitz is right, it does seem unusual that Daniel Duggan is being singled out. Coming up, the impact extradition will have on his family. What's that process look like?
He's taken away immediately. He's gone. His children will never see him again. He will not get a fair trial. There's been nothing fair about this the whole time.
Okay, who's going in the back of the car?
Every Sunday morning since October 2022, Saffrine and her 6 children have visited Daniel Duggan in jail. But this could be one of the last times the kids will see their father.
Come on, we don't want to be late.
Because in 2 weeks, the former fighter pilot will find out if he'll be extradited to America.
Can everyone please get ID? I want you to take all bracelets off. You're not allowed them in there.
To face accusations of sharing secret US military information with China.
Can I help you?
Hi there. We're here to see Dan Duggan. Thank you.
I feel the pressure as time is running out.
Speaking to a friend from inside his maximum security cell, it's clear Duggan is stressed about being away from his family.
I'm a loving father, loving husband. I miss my children terribly.
And the very real possibility of being sent to America.
It's horrible. I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy.
I'm very proud of him. He's very inspirational for me.
18-year-old Molly is Duggan's eldest child. She refuses to believe her dad's a criminal.
I feel like our world's been torn apart. And I want the trauma to stop.
Do you fear that you may never get to have your dad back again?
I probably won't have my dad back again. He's been in maximum security for so long. Can you imagine being isolated like that for so long? He's not going to be the same person that he was before they took him.
It cuts out after 10 minutes, so it's hard to have a long conversation in depth.
There's the emotional side, but what's it actually going to mean for your family if he's extradited?
We're all Australian citizens. It means that my kids lose their father. Our family is torn apart for something that can be stopped. It's absolutely unbelievable to think that Australia would do this.
Yeah,
The sunrise was so pretty this morning, though.
Despite the fact he's an Australian citizen, the Australian government has so far remained quiet on the Duggan case.
Yeah, so true.
Canberra's apparent unwillingness to be involved is particularly disappointing for lawyer Glenn Kolomitz, who's fighting to have Duggan freed. What do you think of our government's handling of this case?
I feel we've sacrificed our sovereignty to the US, our government. I wore the uniform of this country for most of my adult life. It's lapdog diplomacy.
There needs to be a very powerful message that this behaviour is unacceptable.
British MP Tobias Elwood says Daniel Duggan's predicament should be a cautionary tale for ex-servicemen from all Western nations.
The very clear-cut situation now is that you will be watched and eventually you'll end up probably behind bars. Therefore, think twice before taking your first paycheck from a competitor.
It's one man up against the might of the United States government. The odds are not stacked in this former Marine Major's favour. Of course, the bid to extradite him might fail and he could walk free. More likely, though, he'll be sent to America to face 4 charges, including conspiracy and money laundering. And if found guilty, a punishment of up to 65 years in prison.
For all the critics out there that would say where there's smoke, there's fire with this case, what would you say to them?
There's no Australian charges whatsoever. Dan was a proud military Marine. He's a proud Australian. He didn't break any laws. Dan is an innocent man. Our truth will win.
I ask the people of Australia to please help us, help my family to fight this injustice.
How was it seeing Bubby?
It's difficult not to feel for Daniel Duggan's wife and young children. Their futures are unclear. But for the United States, going all out to punish a former member of its military, this is a black and white case. Rules are rules.
What does he deserve?
He deserves to come home to his family.
You won't give up, will you?
No, we will not give up. I want to be proud that our Australian government does the right thing and brings Dan home.
Hello, I'm Dimity Clancey. Thanks for watching 60 Minutes Australia. Subscribe to our channel now for brand new stories and exclusive clips every week. And don't miss out on our extra minute segments and full episodes of 60 Minutes on 9now.com.au and the 9Now app.